Professor S.T. Muni and dear participants, Namaste and good afternoon. Welcome to a very special webinar on Nepal's foreign policy by Professor S.T. Muni at this NIICE International Conference on Understanding Nepal's Foreign Policy. Professor S.T. Muni has been very kind to us and always supported us at this initiative. Professor Muni needs no introduction. However, as a tradition, let me briefly introduce the well-introduced Professor Muni. Professor S.T. Muni is a Professor Emeritus, Jawaharlal Nehru University, and member of Executive Council at Mohan Parikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. He has taught, conducted, and supervised research at Jawaharlal Nehru University, National University of Singapore, Banaras Hindu University, and University of Rajasthan. He served as India's special envoy to Southeast Asian countries on UNSC reforms and represented India's Minister of External Affairs at the 5th anniversary celebration of the Paris Peace Conference held in Phnom Penh, Cambodia. He was also India's ambassador to Laos, and he was invited to address the United Nations Special Committee on the Indian Ocean as a zone of peace at Sochi, then as a part of Soviet Union in 1985. Professor Muni was nominated as National Security Advisory Board of India and was the founding executive member of the Regional Center of Strategic Studies, Colombo, and was bestowed with Sri Lanka's highest national honor for a foreign national. Professor Muni, let me once again welcome you to today's international conference on understanding Nepal's foreign policy. Sir, kindly make your remarks in around 30 minutes, which will be followed by question and answers. Professor Muni, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jaiswal. It's a great pleasure to be with your forum. In fact, I was quite hesitant to come because I think a number of Nepali experts have already explored various dimensions of Nepal's foreign policy. And in the last few years, I have seen some of the excellent reports on India's foreign policy, on Nepal's foreign policy and the conferences which have taken place on it. So I may not have much to add, but you know, it's very difficult to say no to Dr. Jaiswal, and therefore I'm here in your midst. Let me flag some of the stray thoughts which I have on Nepal's foreign policy. This has been one of the dearest subject to my heart. I did my PhD on this subject, as some of you may know, and therefore I continue to take interest in it and learn from it, from whatever the Nepali experts and leaders say about it. To my mind, every foreign policy has two very significant variables. One is the character of the state, and second is the nature of external environment. Character of the state, I am not talking in any Marxist sense, but in the sense of its interest, its aspirations, its anxieties, and its capabilities, which are very essential to project at the global or regional level, which is the external environment, which also impinges on any country's foreign policy, including India, anybody. So these are the two basic characters of understanding any country's foreign policy. And if we apply them to Nepal, I find that the foreign policy, as again in case of most of the other countries, is an evolving phenomenon. It has gradually emerged out of it. And I find four phases of Nepal's foreign policy evolution. One phase was in the 18th century when Prithvinarayan Shah was establishing the state, forming the state, and consolidating it. The second phase started with the rise and fall of the Ranas, which you can see. The third stage can be equaled with what you call the resurgent monarchy, and now its demise or its collapse. And lastly, we are in the republican order phase of Nepal's foreign policy. These phases have had different characteristics. But I did not find any comprehensive definition of Nepal's interests or anxieties or aspirations on foreign policy in a detailed manner, in a formal manner. except for, again, the last few years that the efforts are being made really to define it, or except perhaps during Prithvi Narayan Shah, when he gave his small definition of Tarul between two Dhunganas, two big boulders, and a plant between them. None of these other phases really defined. It came out in the various policy statements and speeches, but not really any formal sense. I don't also find much of aspirations of Nepal in terms of foreign policy projection. When I compare it with some of the smaller states in the world, which are situated like Nepal, say for example, Israel or Norway or Singapore, where Norway, for instance, had played a great peacekeeping role all over the world, or Israel has tried to set an order in West Asia, Middle East, as they call it. Singapore is always very proud of punching more than its weight, it calls it. And I don't find such kind of an aspiration that Nepal really wants to make great peace either in the region or at the global level or some of the other regions. This is largely because of the what you call lack of capabilities in terms of foreign policy, in terms of economic, military strength, and to some extent also lack of confidence. I don't want to say it to offend anybody, but I find that as a nation, and I'll come to this point why it is not there. There have been some initiatives, one can call it, say for instance, Nepal's Zone of Peace proposal by King Birendra, or recently after the king, I think Maoists and others have been talking about, now everybody is talking almost, as Nepal being a bridge between India and China. But I find these are not aspirational projections. These are projections of power struggle. These are projections of some ideological parameters or whatever you can call it. Similarly, in terms of Nepal's security, which often occupies a great place in the foreign policies of many of the countries, I don't find, go back to Prithvi Narayan again, when he said we have to be defensive because we have two neighbors which are very big. Besides being defensive, Nepali forces have played a role in domestic order, in terms of they have played a role, international role through the United Nations, or through what you can call recruitment, cooperation or collaboration with other countries like India or United Kingdom. But not in a very significant manner. The security occupies the foreign policy parameter. Military security, it is largely political, and because Nepal doesn't have any existential threat, if you call it, in my understanding, it only has a political challenge of preserving its independence and preserving its dignity. There is no major front-loading in Nepal's foreign policy of the developmental issues in a big way, though it is a developing country and it needs cooperation of the other countries. But there are no major initiatives in terms of what projects Nepal goes and then tries and brings out from. The donors have often been sounding Nepal of what they can do for Nepal and whether it is acceptable to Nepal. But as I said, the emphasis largely has been on dignity and independence, because in the past, Nepal has passed through various pressures and various duresses. It lost the war to China in 1792 and to Tibet. It lost the war to Tibet and had to accept the Chinese suzerainty. Even it was a tributary state. It again, in the context of Chinese march into Tibet, it had to lean very heavily on India, even accepted the foreign policy coordination and military posts so far as Nepal-Tibet border was concerned because of the existential security threat. So there are elements of then India has on couple of occasions has imposed what you call the blockade, which disturbed, and there is a continuous complaint of interference from the Indian side, if not from other side. So largely the emphasis has been on dignity and independence rather than on the sovereignty or existential security or developmental dimension or the aspirations and new innovative initiatives which foreign policies can take. Now, what therefore has been reflected or driven, what has driven foreign policy moves which Nepal makes, despite the formal engagement, and largely because of if it's a question of dignity and independence, then Nepal has found its answer through engagement. And engagement at various levels, engagement at bilateral levels, engagement at United Nations, engagement in multilateral groupings and regional organizations, whether it is SAARC or BIMSTEC or things of that sort. So Nepal has expressed its concern and its anxiety for its independence and dignity more diplomatically, more politically. And here again, I am reminded of a beautiful sentence which is not often quoted from Prithviraj Shah, wherein in the end he says our forces have to be defensive and where defense fails, we have to work through tact or we have to work through persuasion or even deceit, he said. So it's largely a diplomatic exercise through which Nepal has tried to guard its question of dignity and independence in terms of, but what has been driving it? What has been driving it is the internal political power struggle, I would say. I mean, the dignity and independence concepts have been translated into regime dignity, regime independence, or regime security. And right since the Ranas, if not during the Gorkha kingdom, which was established by Prithviraj Shah, and his successors nursed it. In fact, they expanded it, went up to Kumaon and Sikkim. Except for that period, since the Ranas, this is largely a power struggle, and internal polity in Nepal has been quite fractured, quite fragmented. As a result, people have sought the internal power balances through the help of external forces or external sources of support, if you put it this way. And in that context, largely the neighbors and the great powers, to some extent, have come into play. So this national dignity, as I said, has been driven by the sense of regime security. That was true during the Ranas, which were internally split between the monarchy and the Rana oligarchy, which wanted to have stakes in power. It had stakes in power, did not allow the monarchy to come in. And later on, monarchy also, when the Ranas went out, also got a struggle into monarchy and the democratic forces, the democratic fight, which started in 1951, the struggle has been there. And unfortunately, even after Nepal's establishment as a federal republic, democratic republic, the party struggles have really made the polity unstable. And foreign policy as a tool of many of the internal struggles to be carried out. So this is a practice which has continued. I am not taking examples of foreign policy issues which have been dealt with largely. Now, I mentioned earlier that King Birendra used the what you call zone of peace as a very innovative concept, but primarily the concept was driven by the sense of internal security, largely because you recall it was cast in the context of 1975 when India had brought about a change in the status of Sikkim. And there was, and largely through the struggle between monarchy and the democratic forces. And I think he therefore apprehended that perhaps something like that can also happen in Nepal, because earlier India had come out in support of the democratic forces during his father's tiff or conflict with the Nepali Congress. And therefore he wanted to ensure by zone of peace means no external interference. That was largely the thrust of the whole project. So we have this internal what you call power struggle driving Nepal's foreign policy, and it comes out in various ways. So during all the three phases, not the first one, all the three phases, this has been a major driver of critical foreign policy issues in case of Nepal. Now on the external side, this is therefore internally, if you really want to get back to the interests which are, then Nepali polity will have to be stabilized. If the Nepali polity cannot be stabilized, then you cannot have a coherent, consistent foreign policy. Unfortunately, I don't find many issues on which there is a broad national consensus across the fault lines, political fault lines of power struggle on foreign policy issues, on any foreign policy issues. In fact, I have seen leaders and the parties changing their track on one particular issue when they are in power and when they are not in power. And it is largely through that equation. Therefore, if the Nepali polity gets stabilized, and this is not a pejorative expression, it is largely an expression of the reality existing. In fact, no government has completed its term after it became Republican Nepal. And even when the monarchy was there, no foreign minister continued consistently in his office. Somebody calculated over 67 years, there were 71 foreign ministers which came and went during the monarchy's period. So you have these problems of stability which have been governing. And I think if polity gets stabilized, I think foreign policy will get a much better direction and a much what you call firmer grip, where the issues of interference and outside meddling into political affairs, micromanaging of political and administrative affairs would perhaps cease to exist. Secondly, the politics has got to be developmental politics. And this is where I see some of the excellent resources of Nepal, which needs to be developed, have not been developed. For instance, tourism, to the extent of, climbing and climbing the Himalayas, it is earning tourist attraction, and tourists are coming there for that purpose. But the infrastructure for tourism, if it can be developed, Nepal can be a major tourist destination. If the pilgrimage and religious tourism can be developed, which other countries, the Chinese are saying, the Indians are saying, develop Lumbini, develop Janakpur Dham, have this network, have that network of pilgrimages. But I think Nepal needs to take a much greater push and put its own resources as far as possible, should have developed much earlier. So once the politics becomes developmental, it would be more tuned to the popular aspirations, and Nepal's aspirations would go. I do see signs of that. In the last 5-10 years, I do see indications. For instance, the new document which the foreign ministry has produced on foreign policy, or the debate which is now these days taking place, lists development as a part of the objectives of Nepal in the last few years. I'm talking, it was not listed earlier. It has not been there. Now it is being listed. But for that, you have to develop your resources. Tourism is one, hydropower is another. Here again, I do find changes in the hydropower now. With the democratization, I think the polity is becoming more and more grassrooted polity. And as a result of that, it is still fragmented, but it is getting the developmental dimension slowly emerging into that. And with these two aspects developing, the stability of the polity and its developmental dynamics would give a very new and different meaning to Nepal's foreign policy. On the external environmental side, you know, the regional relations are very critical. And this is where I think the genius of Prithvi Narayan Shah very clearly stated the geopolitical context in the sense of Tarul and Dungana. And from this, in the regional context, a lot of new slogans and new definitions of approach to region have come up, like equidistance, balance of power, counterbalance. I think to some extent you need to revisit Prithvi Narayan Shah's statement more carefully. And if I read it out to you, its aspect, you will realize that what is being not being looked into. Number one, well, let me see the statement first. He said, the kingdom is like a tarul between two big stones. Great friendship should be maintained with the Chinese emperor. Friendship should also be maintained with the emperor of the southern seas, the British. He is entrenching himself in the plains. Do not engage in an offensive attack. Fighting should be done on a defensive basis. If it is found difficult to resist in the fight, then even means of persuasion, tact, and deceit should be employed. I want to draw your attention to two aspects. First, when he is referring to the Southern Empire or the Southern Emperor, he is referring to the British Empire, against which the later on Shah rulers had been fought when the British Empire was still trying to establish itself. And he is unhappy that British Empire had suppressed India, or Hindustan, as he called Bharatvarsh. Now, this is where the general mistake which many analysts do is to just replace British Empire with a republican India is to some extent unfair, because in India as it existed had a very close relationship with Nepal even during Prithvi Narayan Shah's time. And even later on, I mean, there are several instances of the huge cultural contiguity, the economic contiguity, geographical contiguity had put these two countries very close to each other. So when he was talking of the Southern Empire, he was talking of the British imperialism. And the British imperialisms really, if I wish Prithvi Narayan Shah was present when India became independent, I'm sure he would have revised this statement. And the second part is in the last, when he underlines a persuasion, deceit, and tact. That is largely the role of diplomacy in dealing with the neighbors, which I think Nepal has continued to do. So this statement has to be understood properly, because he is not balancing simply South and North. He was trying to seek a balance between two empires, the Chinese Empire and the British Empire. Of course, the Chinese Empire went out later, and to that extent, Nepal even accepted to have a foreign policy coordination with India, for which India is being blamed, and India then was asked to pack up and go after a few years. But the fact that Nepal accepted that proposition and India also accepted, outsourced its foreign and security policy to India, which Nepal did, was largely because of the changed geopolitics by the Chinese moving into Tibet. Not only Chinese moving into Tibet, but issuing a statement where Nepal was considered as one of the fingers of the palm, and palm being the Tibet. Now, people in many ways, forget this memory. But during the mid-50s, the Chinese drew up the maps which showed this palm and five-finger intent. Therefore, there were worries in Nepal and there were worries in India. And therefore, both of them wanted to go together so far as security and foreign policy was concerned. And that's why there was even a proposal of foreign policy coordination between India and Nepal at that time. So we must understand the nuances of Prithvi Narayan's statement, and we must understand the context in which it was really drawn. Now, the second proposition about the neighbors is, building a bridge between India and China. When you build a bridge, which is good, that you are connecting the two great neighbors for facilitating each other. But what kind of a bridge would it be, whether it is practical, in the sense that will it be a one-way traffic, one-way transit bridge for the Chinese, or it will be a two-way traffic bridge, which any bridge should be. Now, even now, I find that on the border, the relationship between, the movements between from Nepal to Tibet are not actually freely two-way. There are a lot of problems. But if the bridge happens between India and China, with Nepal being a bridge, how many Indians would be allowed to go into Tibet in terms of the communications and connectivity? Therefore, there are reservations on the Indian side, because India doesn't want Nepal to act as a bridge of one-way transit or one-way traffic, which only brings in people or people and goods or whatever services, but doesn't take it two-way. India and China have huge trade between them. They don't really need a bridge so far as economic linkages are concerned, and they are doing pretty well. In fact, in last 2 years, even when India wanted to reduce its trade with Tibet, with China, the trade really has grown between the two countries. So anyway, there are practical aspects of the bridge role being played. There is another aspect of the neighborhood balances, that whichever is the stronger neighbor, Nepal has very softly leaned towards that. It has, as I said, when in the 1790s, China asserted itself for the sake of Tibet, even in the war which was initiated by Nepal, that the balance was in favor of China. So they accepted the Chinese suzerainty and accepted the tributary status. Later on, when China emerged as a communist power, was still very weak. India was far more promising in terms of democracy and others. There was much better relationship between Nepal and India, much smoother relationship. And Nepal did depend or look towards India for all kind of help and assistance. So there has been a tendency, and we find it now also, that China has taken an edge over India in economic matters, in military matters, in overall political clout in whole of Asia. And Nepal finding itself comfortable with China, which was not there in the 50s and 60s and even to some extent 70s. So that's how it has tried to balance itself. Until recently, Foreign Minister Pradeep Ghewali had even said that this kind of a competition, or the two neighbors agitating against each other opens up opportunities. And he said, and rightly so, I think there is an opportunity in any competition between countries for the third countries in one form or the other. And Nepal has every right and is trying to take advantage of those opportunities. But all that I can say is that those opportunities should be utilized with a great deal of assessment as to what these opportunities are for Nepal's national interest. They should not simply be the Chinese projects. I have written elsewhere that China is very keen to push into South Asia for its own reasons. And therefore, even if some country resists that, China would give a push. This is a difference from the China of the 60s and 70s, because in 60s and 70s, the smaller neighbors of India, whenever they wanted China to come for counterbalancing, for balancing, China did come. Now it's not coming for balancing. It is coming in pursuance of its own interests. And as I said, I've written somewhere 3-4 drivers of China's South Asia policy, which will show that. So one has to assess as to what kind of some of the BRI projects which have tempted India's neighbors are now being questioned. They were questioned in Sri Lanka. They were questioned in Pakistan. They are now being questioned. Even China is revising some of these projects for various reasons. So while trying to have these opportunities, one should assess them, and one has to be extremely careful as to how these would be utilized or what implications they will have. Certainly, in any balance, in any term of seeking opportunities, one cannot go to the extent of endangering or threatening the vital interests of the other neighbor. Nepal cannot do anything with India to really harm China, and vice versa. Nepal will not do, and it has reiterated again and again that it will not do, but it should not let itself into a situation where it might find sometimes helpless. Therefore, one has to be very careful and cautious in going through some of these opportunities which are opening up. So this is a major area of Nepal's foreign policy of dealing with the neighbors, as it is so situated. As these two countries are so huge, so big, so assertive, so pushing, that Nepal has to take care and protect its interests, which are well defined, which in the larger interest of the nation, not in the regime alone, which has to be done. The future challenges of Nepal's foreign policy, as I say, is, as I mentioned earlier, domestic stability in terms of power system and in terms of developmental goals, which are absolutely where it has to build its capabilities and professionalism. I would say even professionalism in diplomacy is a great need for Nepal. Many of the diplomatic posts are being distributed as patronage. Political patronage, not in terms of professionalism, which needs to be done. And now New Nepal has a federal structure. And in India, we are a federal country. And I know that in a federal country, the interest of the boundary states, which are on the international boundary, count very much in shaping some of the critical foreign policy issues. And I think in Nepal also, both in relation to India and China, the role of the boundary states will increase. And I don't think Nepal's foreign office is prepared to cope with it in any serious manner. Therefore, in the emerging challenge would be this. Nepal is a young country, is a new country. It has a great human resource with it. And that human resource in terms of migratory labor is getting a lot of economic advantage to Nepal. But I think on the developmental count, on the domestic count, the challenge of this, because this labor, because of disturbances elsewhere, like in Middle East particularly, extremism there, radicalization there, which can come back, really lend our people, Indian people are lent into trouble. Nepalese people are lent into trouble. To rescue them, to support them, the local laws are very harsh against them. To defend these people, their freedom, their dignity, one has to be very well equipped. So there is also a need to, deal with this humanitarian aspect or the human resource aspect in a far more careful manner. One has to send a skilled labor, train them, prepare them for a foreign journey, and if need be, Nepal should be capable of defending them. These are some of the assets which Nepal have: the hydropower, which has a foreign policy dimension; the human resources, which has a foreign policy dimension; tourism, which has a foreign policy dimension. But they are also very strong in terms of internal development and internal prosperity, which is equally essential for Nepal. So I think they have to be integrated when it comes to foreign policy. The foreign policy needs to be streamlined in a big way to take care of Nepal's quote-unquote national interest, not regime interest alone. Regime interest cannot be avoided. I understand. Anybody who is in power would like to remain in power and would like to protect it. And if the foreign policy is supporting that regime, the foreign policy moves which support that regime will be initiated. But that should not be the sum and total of the entire foreign policy, or the major emphasis should be on that aspect. I think the regime interest will be well protected if there is a greater political stability there. I mean, I have seen phases in Nepal's history, even contemporary history, where an internal unity has not allowed any kind of undesirable influence from outside, including from India, to interfere into it in one way or the other. So what is needed is the internal consolidation politically and a developmental orientation. These are the challenges which Nepal will face in future. I think I can stop here and leave you to grill me if you so want.
Thank you, sir. Professor S.D. Muni, thank you very much for your wonderful presentation. It's always fascinating. It's always fascinating to hear Professor Muni. Professor Muni, we have received a huge number of questions on different platforms like Facebook, Twitter, and Zoom chat. Hence, without any delay, let me share maybe two questions. One is like, how do you look at India-Nepal relations under Prime Minister Modi and the previous NDA government headed by Dr. Manmohan Singh? And second is, how do you look at Nepal-China relations in days to come, at the time where India and China have standoffs and clashes at the Himalayan frontier? How challenging will it be for Nepal to balance its relations with both of its neighbors?
Well, these are what you call the sterling questions, which almost cover major dimensions of Nepal's foreign policy. So far as comparing Manmohan Singh with Modi's government is, the Manmohan Singh was always, the neighborhood first, which Prime Minister Modi initiated, is a consistent theme in India's foreign policy, whether it is so defined or not. Let us be very, very clear. And I think Manmohan Singh also did everything which he thought it could be done for the good of Nepal. There is a question of the Maoist movement there. I mean, thrice Manmohan Singh told the king of Nepal that he should settle with the democratic forces, and we will do whatever is possible in confronting the Maoists, help Nepal in confronting the Maoists. The king gave assurances and did not do that. The fractured economy. So in order to take and bring Maoist into the mainstream, I think India, actively got involved into that process. And later on, the only flaw which was there on Manmohan Singh is that he was not a great traveler like Prime Minister Modi. He did not travel to the neighborhood. Many times he was criticized, and rightly so. Even within India, he was criticized that he is not winning the confidence of the neighbors. And to that extent, he faltered so far as Nepal was concerned. It is also unfortunate that during his 10 years, or to some extent even before that, India has not been able to take any mega projects in Nepal. Mega developmental infrastructure projects, and some of the infrastructure projects like the Hulaki Road and others got delayed unduly and were not completed. Many times promises were made. In fact, the delivery deficit is a great problem of India's foreign policy as a whole, not only vis-a-vis Nepal, but vis-a-vis many other countries that India has made promises which have not been delivered. Now, Modi regime gave a great positive signal that it is going to remain in close touch with the neighbors and will revive all the relations. And unfortunately, there was an element of assertion of India's interest or India's perceptions in foreign policy. It was that assertion which started alienating some of the neighbors. Pakistan was the first one on trade issue, delegation was not allowed. Then Nepal came on the question of constitutions. Sri Lanka came. I don't want to go into other countries, but so far as Nepal was concerned, I think within few months or years, within few months, Prime Minister Modi's second visit to Nepal was not as enthusiastic as the first visit. Let us be very, very clear. Therefore, under the neighborhood first policy, a greater thrust of India's own objectives and interests in Nepal to some extent disturbed the relationship. And that relationship, I think, has not yet been stabilized. Unfortunately, due to the implications of blockade, but even otherwise. I mean, India has tried to do a lot of course corrections. I mean, they have tried to please the Nepali leaders personally if they got hurt on various issues, but it has not succeeded. And I think it will not really stabilize, to my mind, until again there is a greater stability in Nepal, and Nepal shows the direction in which it wants to take India-Nepal relations. So there is a problem there. There is a problem in Indian side because on India, firstly, there is very little time devoted, even during Modi's period, very little time devoted to Nepal. And secondly, there are many mutually competitive stakeholders on India's Nepal policy, which impinge on each other's and do not allow a balanced or a consistent policy. So there are problems on both the sides. And unless these problems are taken care of, I feel that, the Saas Bahu kind of a rishta, which we have on very many TV serials, that kind of a relationship will continue between India and Nepal. Love and hate, sometimes very good, sometimes not very good, largely driven by personal emotions and personal aspirations on both the sides, I would say. So far as India-China competition is concerned, look, it is going to be long drawn. And I sometimes shudder to think that it can take a military dimension. And if it takes a military dimension, I think a country like Nepal has to be very, very cautious in being on the right position between the two. Nepal is absolutely free to have the closest of the economic relations with China, but that economic relations must not bring in the strategic stakes which will shrink the Indian presence, the creative, constructive presence in Nepal. And if that happens, then it will disturb the whole relationship. And Nepal can be very vulnerable, both from the Chinese and the Indian side. So I think Nepal is entering a phase where India-China relationship is going to be very intensely competitive, and in some areas even conflictual. If the border agreement is not settled properly, it would be very difficult for the two countries to have a normal relationship. Prime Minister Modi tried through informal symmetry and others, but I think the Chinese have a different agenda before them. And I think it is very, very difficult. Unfortunately, this competitive, conflictual relationship has also been overlapping with the US-China relationship, which is equally complicating. And in Nepal is also facing that kind of a spillover, like the MCC project, which again is caught into domestic internal power struggle, power equations, or whatever you call it. So I think Nepal needs to be very cautious in selecting projects, in pursuing engagements. Economically, I'm sorry to say, I may sound very bad. I hate to do that, but economically, there is no better option for Nepal but to have close, constructive relationship with India. Largely because, the whole question of transit through China, etc., are all politically very exciting propositions, but they will not deliver on the economic count. And economically, I think India should do its best to see that Nepal emerges. We are all very happy to see that Nepal is now from least developed to the developing countries category. It has come, and it must grow its economic strength. And that's why I said, go back to tourism, go back to hydropower, go back to your human resources, whatever assets Nepal has. These assets have to be consolidated, strengthened, and wherever possible needs to be cashed. So unless that is being done, and for that, the Chinese projects are most welcome, but they should not be the projects of strategic nature. Mind it, don't forget, the China started as a commercial port in Gwadar. It is now has a security dimension. It started as a commercial port in Hambantota. It has a security dimension. Some of the roads cannot be without strategic considerations in one way or the other. So therefore, one needs to be very cautious in dealing with this competitive relationship.
Thank you, sir. So you just mentioned about MCC, US-China competition, and we have received lots of questions on that. So let me try to club one or two. How do you look at America's MCC? Is Nepal going to be affected by China-US competition? If yes, how intense will be their competition in Nepal? Similarly, what policies should Nepal adopt in terms of security where both India and China's interests are vested?
Say it again, the last question.
What policies should Nepal adopt in terms of security where both India and China's interests are vested?
No, I said, in terms of security, your security is largely diplomatic. It has nothing to do with military strain. And therefore, the best proposition would be to avoid areas of irritation in your relationship, both with China on the one hand and India on the other. On China on the one hand, for instance, there's a whole question of now border villages and encroachments, which are coming up in Nepal also. And I mean, the government has terminated them. The government in India also would not publicly say that the Chinese have encroached into some of the Indian territory, because the governments have to be accountable for that. So the governments have their own problems, but the fact remains that this kind of a pressure which would be generated. Now it is in terms of the MCC, look, there is no doubt that the Americans are trying to deal with the Chinese expanding influence everywhere. And MCC would not have come without that proposition. Now the whole question of building up infrastructure in Asia and the Indo-Pacific region largely coming out of that. So it will have, it's a competitive, and with that competition, there are ideological issues attached to that because they are talking about democracy, but you have democracy. So there is no hesitation. There is no pressure on you to have democracy. Nepal is already a democracy, a country which is not having democracy like say, Vietnam. If the MCC is taken over there, then there is a question of a pressure. But on the top of it, Nepal had accepted that proposition earlier. MCC proposal had been accepted earlier. Now, largely because of the internal power equations, I say, the whole debate is going on over there. And you have to decide whether you can manage this package of assistance or not. If you are looking for opportunities, as Minister Gewali said it, well, this is also an opportunity which you should take advantage of it without the cost which is involved in it. Now, that is where the whole Nepali diplomacy would be called in. So MCC, you have accepted. Hopefully, you accepted it with all the proper assessment which should have been done. If it has not been done, have an expert assessment. Don't have a political party assessment, which goes because of the power and other structures. And then see if it is in Nepal's interest. You must go ahead with the project. Otherwise, you will lose that. 500 million is not a big deal. I understand that. But then many billions which have been offered to you by the Chinese have also not in details been worked out as to who will put in how much of money and how will that money be utilized. Many of the projects there, the survey reports have not yet cleared the desks. So there are problems everywhere else. And I think all depends upon professionalism in foreign policy rather than patronage in foreign policy.
Thank you, sir. We're running out of time. So let me put the last two questions, though we have around 28 more questions to be answered. But one is like you just mentioned about China's BRI. Nepal has signed an MOU on China's Belt and Road Initiative. However, there has not been any remarkable progress. What might be the reason behind it? This is one. Second is that media plays an important role in maintaining relationships between two states. As seen presently, Indian media has been very insensitive with the headlines, whether it is about Lipule or about Manisha Koirala being in support of her country and using very inappropriate headlines regarding Nepal's Prime Minister. So is it not a part of policy to be sensitive regarding these issues?
Well, firstly, on the BRI, see, the BRI is a great vision of President Xi. And therefore, initially, the Chinese went up with great enthusiasm and excitement, in which many of the economically non-viable projects were undertaken. And there is a huge rethinking within China on some of the BRI projects, whether they should be undertaken or they should not be undertaken. And one of the projects which have been discussed even in China for its non-viability is the rail project in relation to Nepal, from Tibet to Kathmandu train, which they are bringing about. And it's very expensive. Its economic returns are debatable. So the BRI all over, as I said earlier also, all over the region are being questioned and being revisited. And therefore Nepal should also look into that aspect of the BRI project. So take a project which you need, which Nepal needs. Take a project which you can monitor and manage more effectively, rather than a project. I have seen some of the MOUs which are signed by China, in which the whole attempt is to integrate Nepali economy with the Chinese economy, including the special economic zones, SEZs and others. And some of the documents, MOU documents, have very clearly written that the planning of these projects, and Nepal will have to welcome the investments of Chinese. Now, you had other investment agreement with India, which was terminated next day. Anyway, you should look into some of these areas which are sensitive areas, and go ahead with whatever projects which are coming from Nepal, from China under BRI. Now they want to link you up with Pakistan and Afghanistan under the Himalayan Trans-Himalayan connectivity corridor, which they want to build up, which is a part of the BRI. Now, to what extent it would be helpful, whether it is possible, how long will it take? One has to decide about that, and BRI projects therefore have to be vetted in terms of Nepal's national interest, and those Nepal's national interests on which you have a national consensus, not only a political division which is going on overall. So far as nationalism and Manisha Koirala or Hrithik Roshan or Madhuri Dixit, I mean, these are politically motivated media debates. Media loves sensationalism, and they promote sensationalism. The mature and more nationalist media would really take care of the interests of the nation rather than interest of selling few copies one day or having TRPs the other day.
Thank you, Professor Muni. Thank you so much for your wonderful session and valuable time. We hope to have you again in the future. We wish you good health. We'd also like to thank all our participants for their question. We apologize that we could not raise all the questions. We promise to have Professor Muni again in future. As you are aware by now, that it is very difficult for Professor Muni to decline my offer. So thank you so much and have a nice day. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you.